Here's everything we know about the PS6. Why are gamers furious about the new PS5 update? Did devs just admit that the PS5 is the best? How's it going, everyone? Welcome to PSReady. I am coming off of a cold, so sorry if my voice sounds a little weird. I'm like right there at 90%, but definitely good enough to film a video, so I figured I'd work in this early week news update, starting out with The Last of Us PC specs. Before we get into those, the show just ended last night. I watched the last two episodes back to back, and overall, you could definitely make a really good case that this is the best video game adaptation of all time, right up there with me for Castlevania. I think it nailed most of the stuff I wanted to see. My only big complaints with the show overall are that it cut out a lot of the infected and it cut out a lot of the violence. I understand that like half of the game is when you're playing the game, and during the clicker moment towards the beginning of the show, they did include a section like that, and if you keep including gameplay sections, it's going to make the show too long and bog it down. It just feels like that even in the story beat moments where, you know, something violent happened in the game, a lot of the time they would cut that down to as little violence as possible. I mean, even having the death scene recreated by the bloater was awesome on the surface, but then you realize that it's off screen and totally blurry. I would have liked to see more like on-screen violence, especially from Joel. I think they did that just to make him more sympathetic because of how the game ends, but for me personally, I think him being so violent throughout the game is what sort of makes it believable that he'd be able to survive what happens at the end of the game. I don't know, those are small complaints though. It was pretty great across the board. I'd give it like a 9 out of 10. The acting, the set pieces, the overall production value, everything about that felt like a tried and true HBO show. They did say that The Last of Us Part 2 will be covered in the second season and the third season, which is pretty cool and makes sense because the story in that game is so long. I'm curious who they're going to cast to play Abby, but you know, whenever the show comes back, I'll be watching. It was a great watch from start to finish. But yeah, now that the show is over, we not only have The Last of Us multiplayer to look forward to, we also have The Last of Us Part 1 coming to PC in just a couple weeks. I am super excited for it. It's coming out March 28th, which again is in a couple weeks, and I will be playing this day one. They put out the PC specs, and outside of one specific specification that you might be able to guess, it actually looks pretty easy to run, which is keeping it in line with other PS releases over on PC. So for the minimum spec, which is 720p at 30 FPS at minimum settings, so low settings, all you're gonna need is a 970. That's a pretty easy card to get your hands on. You're gonna need 16 gigs of RAM, which like in 2023, everyone probably has 16 gigs of RAM. They say 100 gigabytes of usable space. Definitely use an SSD on your PC, whether it's a mid-range or a high-range PC or a low-range PC. You're gonna want those quick loading times. And then curiously, the recommended spec is 60 FPS at 1080p, which is weird because the PS5 runs it at a much higher resolution at 60 FPS. But for that, you're gonna need a 2070 Super, which is a pretty big jump over the 970, but still a very affordable card at this point now that the shortage has been over for a long time. They still stick with 16 gigabytes of RAM and once again 100 gigabytes of SSD storage space. I'm assuming this is going to be like Dead Space, where it'll work worse if you have an HDD and it'll actually warn you when you start the game up. So definitely get an SSD. Performance is 60 FPS at 1440p, which is exactly where I want to be with this game, and for that I think I'm good. They recommend a 2080 Ti for that with 32 gigs of RAM, still 100 gigabytes of SSD space. My PC has a 3080 Ti, so it should be fine. And then for their ultra setting, which is 4K 60 FPS at the ultra preset, you're going to need an RTX 4080. So yeah, this one's going to be a little out of reach for most people. I'm not really worried about that, but that's pretty much better than PS5 performance, and you're going to pay for that performance. So it's a little higher than most games would be, but this is a full-on PS5 only game. That was kind of expected. Judging by how well Sony's ports have run in the past, I mean, even Returnal just recently had very minor flaws. It was an incredible port. I'm expecting a lot out of this game, even though they had to delay it at the last second just to get a few more tweaks in. I'm assuming it's just because they want to make sure they put their best foot forward with this game now that they've got a ton of new fans of it coming off of the show. But yeah, that's coming out March 23rd. I'll give you my impressions when it drops. I'm excited to play this on Steam Deck because I've played it so many times. Having it on a handheld alongside all my other favorite Resident Evil games, which are totally at home on a handheld, I think this will be a perfect experience for The Last of Us Part 1. Next up, let's talk about this Activision Blizzard thing, because Sony, we heard Jim Ryan basically said, I don't want to make a deal, I want to block your merger. We can see that their strategy is doing whatever they have to do to make sure this merger doesn't go through, and even even knowing that, I think they took it a little too far with this one. Basically, they've pointed out that if Microsoft owns Call of Duty, even if they do continue to release it over on the PlayStation 5, they could intentionally sabotage the game with weird bugs or disconnections or making sure that it's inferior in some way. And honestly, I don't think that would ever be the case. I mean, obviously Sony is saying like, oh, they would do that so that people would switch back over to Xbox or PC, and then Xbox would make money that Sony isn't. But this game's entire market share is entirely dominated by PlayStation, so it would be unthinkably stupid for Microsoft to intentionally sabotage the game, because it's not like people are going to say, oh, this game isn't working on the PlayStation 5. I'm going to go out and buy a $500 Xbox Series X and play it there. They're going to say, oh, I'm kind of done with Call of Duty until they fix this, because if that was ever able to be proven, there'd be like lawsuits and stuff like that as well, because, you know, Sony's not letting something like that go, right? They're going to say we had the best working version of this game for years, and then suddenly when Microsoft picks up the IP, it starts working less good on our system. They have verifiable data there just by like pointing out the last few years of Call of Duty running better on PlayStation 5. I don't think that would really work out all too well for Microsoft. Where I do agree with Sony though, is that there's no real reason to believe that Microsoft will actually honor their deal, because they're famous for making promises and breaking them. Sony actually has it in their document. They say, here's a few examples of Microsoft buying stuff, making promises, and then walking back those promises after just a few years. And then they also give the great example of Bethesda, where it's like, why would we trust that Microsoft will continue to release games like Call of Duty over on PS5 when they're already making games they picked up from Bethesda that probably had PS5 versions in development at one point exclusive to Xbox, like Starfield, for example. There's no way that game did not start with PS5 in mind as well. And then when Xbox picked up the studio, they basically said, hey, this is going to become an exclusive on Xbox. You can stop working on the PS5 version for now. There's no way that didn't happen, right? So seeing that happen, Sony actually has some pretty good evidence there. And my whole point is, when they have evidence like that, I don't think they need to say, oh, Microsoft would intentionally make Call of Duty worse, because I don't really think that's really something they would do. But I'd love to hear if you think so down in the comments below. Regardless, I hope this deal wraps up sooner rather than later, especially with E3 being right around the corner, or Xbox and Sony's E3 stream. I don't want that to be totally taken up by them reassuring gamers that Call of Duty will still be on PlayStation. Like, that's just boring to me. I want to see new games. I want to have new stuff to be excited about. I want to have actual games to be excited about, and not have to hear corporate heads tell me that, like, yeah, I'll be able to play Call of Duty on PlayStation, because there's no way that Call of Duty will not be on PlayStation. It's the best-selling game pretty much ever at this point. It's the most guaranteed best-selling franchise possible. There's no way they can even afford to not release it on PlayStation. So for that reason, I'm not really concerned. Next up, Final Fantasy 16 is really the next big PS5 game to be excited for. It's coming out in June, so all the interviews are happening around the internet right now. And one of the interviews that I read basically admitted that the PS5 was completely necessary for this game to work. So during one of the demo sessions, IGN found that there was like seamless transitions from boss battles back to regular gameplay, which was kind of awesome. And they asked about it, and basically the response was, while you're battling Ifrit and Garuda and having that big battle in the hands-on demo, in the background the PS5 is loading the next scene. It's getting ready so we can seamlessly move to it. Later on, there's a quote that says, to be able to do all of that seamlessly without any load times is possible because of the power of the PS5. If we didn't have the memory the PS5 has, and also the transfer speed of the SSD that the PS5 has, we would still be in development right now. Now, I've seen a ton of articles basically saying that this is them admitting that the PS5 is better than the Xbox, but I think what they're really saying is that this needed to be a next-gen only game, and that makes a lot of sense and honestly gets me excited, because we saw this game announced basically with the PS5, if I remember correctly, and a lot of the games that we saw announced with the PS5 ended up coming to PS4 as well, mainly because they were those cross-generational games we used to get all the time back in the day that were like, oh, this looks marginally better than it did on the PS3, but they put it on PS4 to get people excited about buying a PS4, and there were enough PS4s out there to be taken advantage of. But with the PS5, obviously due to the supply issues, they had to get crafty and backport a lot of games, or make sure that they had a port ready to go at launch for all the PS4 users, going all the way up to God of War Ragnarok. Well, I guess you could consider Resident Evil 4 remake to kind of be the end of that, but I guess that doesn't really count because it's not a first-party game. So as far as first-party games go, God of War Ragnarok, it looks like is going to be the true last PS4 game that's like cross-generation and not developed with PS5 in mind. Now, I've mentioned a few times I play on PC and PS5, and I gotta point out that having that SSD directly interfaced by the PlayStation 5 is what actually actually sets it apart from PC. Like, yeah, my laptop can run games that look better and run at better frame rates than the PS5, and that's awesome. I love that feature a lot. It's great. But the PS5 has instant loading on a ton of games where you really wouldn't expect it. Like even older games from the PS4 generation that got quick patches for the PlayStation 5, they're able to have instant loading, and having that feature makes it feel next gen, especially when you pair it up with the DualSense and all of its features. I love the trigger locking on the DualSense Edge. I love the haptic feedback. I love the adaptive triggers. I love everything about that controller, and pairing that again with instant loading, that's where it really did a big step up in terms of making games feel like a new generation instead of this being like a PS4 Pro 2. Because yeah, across the board, games have looked a lot better on the PlayStation 5 than they did on the PS4, and that's great. But as we've seen, a lot of these games that are PS5 only are now starting to be 30 FPS and not 60 FPS, which sucks because now everyone's gotten a taste of what true 60 FPS gameplay feels like. Whereas I got that a long time ago on PC. I basically only play games that are locked at 60 on PC if I can't get 60 on console. And I gotta say, this generation so far has been great because I've been able to play a lot more games on my PlayStation 5 and not worry about them looking or running better on PC, because a lot of PC games also come out and run like crap these days. They have like stuttering, frame spikes, and other weird issues that never get solved. Like Dead Space is my classic example. That was fixed in a weekend over on PS5, and Motive has completely abandoned it on PC. Despite multiple Reddit threads, multiple Steam discussions, people talking to the developers, a full-on Digital Foundry video about it, they said, no, we're content to leave this game like 80% done. Sorry, enjoy it. Thanks for the $60. We'll see you guys later. So yeah, well, it does kind of suck for Xbox gamers that they're not going to be able to play Final Fantasy 16. I would honestly say it might be worth checking out a PS5. You're going to get a lot of exclusive games that you're not going to be able to play on Xbox, whereas with the Xbox, everything comes to PC day and date there with the exclusive side of things. So if you have a PC already, get a PS5. It's worth it getting a PS5 to go with your PC over an Xbox Series X, in my opinion. But if you're looking at the Xbox and you want to take advantage of Game Pass, more power to you. I still think PS Plus Extra has a better library of games. Even though there's less overall, the stuff you're getting there is of higher quality, but that's up to personal opinion. Next up, let's talk about this new PS5 update. Now, hopefully you've had some time to mess around with it. I've seen a lot of people talking about how great it is using Discord, especially in the new raid in Destiny 2. I, again, was sick all weekend, so I didn't get a chance to partake in contest mode, but it seems like everyone's really enjoying a lot of the new features, especially 1440p variable refresh rate support on gaming monitors. That was so overdue. I'm glad it's here, but it did take way longer than it should have. But one feature is really messing with people to the point where they want it to be optional, and that's game progress. So basically for games like Hogwarts Legacy or God of War Ragnarok, you know, games that have a finite amount of story missions, you can now see your progress through the game displayed on the game by your PlayStation 5. Some people are really positive on this feature, saying that, hey, I don't have to watch walkthrough videos on YouTube to figure out where I am in a game. And some other people are more negative, which is honestly where I lean. They're basically saying, well, I know how far I am through a game. Sometimes that kind of deflates me from actually going and finishing it, right? Like when I'm playing a game, like one I just beat, which was awesome, called Signalis, right towards the end of the game, there was a pretty massive difficulty spike, and I looked up how far I was through the game. I was like, is this the final boss? And I found out that I had a whole extra level after that to get through that had another boss at the end of the game, and I was like, crap, man, I don't know if I can beat this guy. I might have seen everything I'm gonna see from this game, and I could just move on to something else. Luckily, I powered through and ended up finishing the game because that's one of the best survival horror games I think I've ever played, but knowing how far I was along through the game kind of made me not really want to finish it. And then there's the whole other thing where with a game that's older, right? Like Resident Evil 5 is a great example. I'm replaying it again right now, but I tried to start it again last summer, right? And I did it in between big releases, and I was just rushing through it. I was like, man, I want to know how long this game is so I know how long I have left. And once I hit that point, after I looked it up, I realized that I wasn't really having a ton of fun playing the game because I was just trying to finish it, right? I wasn't just trying to like enjoy it as I was playing it. So knowing how much I had left was kind of ruining the enjoyment for me, and that's kind of what this feature is doing for a lot of people as well on the PlayStation 5. Thankfully, I'm playing a ton of games where this doesn't really come into play, like Destiny 2, but I did also just play Dead Space Remake on my PS5, and thankfully it didn't have this timer activated while I was on the beta, because that kind of would have made me feel like I was rushing through the game just to see the end instead of enjoying it and taking it slow as I made my way through one of the best survival horror games ever. So yeah, basically this only comes into play with survival horror games if you use all of my examples, Signalis, Resident Evil 5, and Dead Space, but I have a very specific type of game I like. And yeah, so you know, it's kind of like personal preference, I guess. You could say, hey, this is a good feature. I want to know how long a game is, how long roughly I have left, because I schedule out all the games I play throughout the year. Or you could say, I don't want to know because I want to be able to just immerse myself and enjoy the game and have it end when it ends and not know it's actually coming. So that's another one I'd love to hear from you down in the comments on. And the last news story I have for you guys today is an update on the weekend story about the PlayStation 6, because I thought it'd be good to just round up all the info we have so far on it, because between the Activision lawsuit stuff, whatever you want to call it, that's going on, all the leaks that came out of that, and now some other stuff, we actually know quite a bit about the PlayStation 6. So the first thing we know is when roughly Sony is planning on launching the next generation of PlayStation. So basically in the report that came out, Sony's lawyers state that Microsoft has offered to continue making Activision's games available on PlayStation only until 2027. And then later on in the document, they say by the time SIE launched the next generation of its PlayStation console, which is likely to occur around redacted, it would have lost access to Call of Duty and other Activision titles, making it extremely vulnerable to consumer switching and subsequent degradation in its competitiveness. So basically what they're saying is that, yeah, this generation would be great having the PS5 get all of the Call of Duty games, but if the PS6 doesn't get it, and that happens right around the time the console launches, that could be a major deciding factor in whether or not people pick up the PS5 or the Xbox Series Z, whatever it's called when that eventually comes out. And I think that is a very fair thing for Sony to be upset about, because it feels like cheating, right? Like they're buying their way into success and buying their way into people buying the Xbox whatever over the PS6. I understand that. That's not the point here. That basically tells us, though, that this generation will probably come to a close around 2027 or 2028, which is crazy because I feel like we just got the PlayStation 5, but it's already almost 3 years old, right? It really sucks, though, in my opinion, that this generation isn't being extended at all to make up for the 2 years of PS4 games that we got on the console. I mean, I know it's not really that big of a deal since not many people had a PS5 for those first 2 years, but for those of us who did have a PS5 for those first 2 years, we were basically beta testing the console for the second wave of games that are going to have all PS5 only features and all that. It's kind of a nitpick, but whatever. It is kind of a little bit disappointing for me as someone who bought it at launch. It's so far in the future, it's honestly hard to comprehend. My only big request is that whatever the PS6 ends up being, it comes in black at launch, because while yes, it was great having those side plates, I want a black console officially from Sony at launch. Kind of a small request, in my opinion at least.